For decades, I've brought classes here on informal walking tours. It's the first warm day of spring. Let's get out of here. We're going to meet in 5 minutes at the cemetery, and then we spend 5 minutes organizing carpools for those who need it. And I give them directions, I pass them out written on paper, and we go for a walking tour. And it's one of the most popular things I've ever done in my classes. So I keep doing it. Since March of last year, I've visited Highland nearly every day and walked 2 or 3 miles with the 16,000 people who inhabit permanently the cemetery. At first I thought I was walking alone. And I'm mulling over everything that's happening in the world. I follow the news pretty closely, and I study history seriously, and I'm passionately, deeply, personally identified with my country. And the best idea of my country is that all people deserve participation, deserve to be treated with dignity and with rights. Now, we've not always kept up to that promise. I'm well aware of that. The guy who most famous for writing that promise was Thomas Jefferson. And he was a hypocrite. He owned slaves from the day he was born till the day he died. Highland Cemetery is an example of the rural cemetery movement, which was an idea that cemeteries should not be the crowded, cramped grave on top of grave urban cemeteries that had prevailed for centuries, where they would dig up the dead once they've rotted away enough so they could bury more dead people there. And the rural cemetery idea, popularized in the United States, not invented, but popularized by Frederick Law Olmsted, the great landscape architect. And the idea was cemeteries should be beautiful, contemplative, natural places that take advantage of the landscape, where you can go and think about the departed, bring the family to visit their grandfather's grave, bring a picnic, play catch, have fun, recreate while you connect to the dead, to the deceased. So this cemetery is an outstanding example of the rural cemetery movement. I could say more about that, but I won't, because I got a timetable to stick to. One thing I decided to add this morning, just this morning, was to read the whole document, a historical document. Some of you may have heard it before. It takes about 2 minutes to read it from beginning to end. And it was a speech delivered in November 1863 at a newly established cemetery called Gettysburg. So I will read the whole speech of President Lincoln's. And there is a part in the middle for a few sentences that's less germane, but every other part is germane to our moment in American history today, this year, and next year. Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. it is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of liberty, a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Abraham Lincoln, November 1863. On the 1st of January 1863, Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation empowered the U.S. War Department to recruit the last untapped manpower supply for the U.S. military, the African Americans. Before 1863, it was a war over slavery, but black people could not fight in it. And Lincoln had been lobbied by many people, including Abraham Lincoln, including Frederick Douglass, to recruit black soldiers. And he did, eventually. And by the end of the war, Lincoln said that the 10% of the Army, the U.S. Army and Navy, that were made up of black people, black men, without them, we could not be winning the war. We could not be, if we withdraw all the black troops, we will lose the war. He said that emphatically to many racists who said, black soldiers, it's a bad idea, man, because, they'll use it to demand equality. And Lincoln said, yeah, without them, then we will lose. I have skipped over a few things. And the first thing I wanted to say, I'll say now. Good morning. I acknowledge the ancestral caretakers of the land on which we stand, on which we gather here today, are the indigenous peoples. More specifically, I acknowledge that the lands of the Huron River Valley were the territories of the Miami, Delaware, Sauk, Shawnee, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples for many, many generations. I grew up in the Midwest, and every year, Memorial Day was a big day. I grew up in Indianapolis, so it was a big day for two reasons. There was a car race there, and it was Memorial Day. And the Vietnam War was going big. So the Memorial Day was wrapped into fast cars and militaristic patriotism. In my family, people, I was taught to look critically at both. Race cars are fine if you like that kind of thing. Nobody in my family ever went to the Indianapolis 500. I'm not knocking it if you went, if you want to go. So, I have 3 aims for this talk. One is to be more in the spirit of the first Memorial Day, which took place on May 1st, 1865, and then was quickly forgotten. I've not described it, but it's a story worth telling. While other communities, such as Columbus, Georgia, claimed to have invented Memorial Day. It was called Decoration Day originally. Columbus, Georgia, wrapped it all around Confederate symbolism. Like, Confederates were brave, brave, brave men. We honor them. Those Yankees were pretty brave too, even though they outnumbered us and had more guns. That's why they won, those sneaky bastards. They cheated. The second thing I want to try to do, is to address topics appropriate to the landscape of this cemetery. And much of that will be in the film, the video that Matt Cook is putting together, that we filmed outside of this building. What was that new birth of freedom? Who created that? Who understood that? And also, third point, a year ago today was Memorial Day, 2020. And an event happened. Just coincidentally on that day. It wasn't because it was Memorial Day. And that's the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And now, for police to kill a black man in America, an unarmed black man, that is not most of the time news, tragically. But after George Floyd's murder, something amazing and unpredicted happened. Tens of millions of people in this country and around the world marched against racism, protested against racism. And that's had some impact on a lot of things. Not everything. So, as I was going through these 5 or 6 times a week, walking 3 miles in the cemetery, just thinking about these things, I realized I wasn't walking alone. I was walking with my country, thinking about it. And thinking about the possibilities of maybe someday soon getting close to that new birth of freedom that should have been achieved so very long ago. Okay, now the next thing I want to do is cover a few basic facts. Probably everybody here knows these facts. First fact, the Civil War was caused by slavery. That's a fact. There's no disputing that fact by well-informed people. There's much disputing that fact by people who are afraid of the vaccine, by people who are afraid or unwilling to discuss evidence. All other causes of the Civil War are non-causes or derived from slavery. One popular idea is that slavery didn't cause the Civil War. A conflict of constitutional theories between the North and the South caused the Civil War. The South believed in states' rights, and the North believed in an all-powerful government, central government. Well, the problem with that is that there's no evidence to support that. The Confederacy had no respect for states' rights of its member states. significantly fewer students of mine at Eastern in recent years have been taught that theory in high school than 20 years ago, 25 years ago. I've been at Eastern since the last dinosaur was on campus. And now I'm one of those dinosaurs. But the fact that fewer people have been in my classes at Eastern have been miseducated about American history gives me great hope for the future of my country. Because it's the young people that will be in charge. Moving on. Hello, groundskeepers. In early 1863, the War Department authorized the state of Michigan to raise a regiment of black troops. It was begun in early 1863, and it was first given one name, but later on, once the regiment was moved into the Eastern Shore, it was renamed as the 102nd United States Colored Troops Regiment, or the 102nd USCT. And here in this cemetery are the graves of 20 or 25 men who served in the 102nd USCT, and a number of other graves of black men who served in other all-black regiments. These men did not die during combat. They were lucky. They got to come home after the war, and home was Ypsilanti. Some of them lived for 10 years, some lived for 50 years. They made full lives for themselves. Strictly speaking, Memorial Day is a day to honor the dead from America's wars. But broadly speaking, Memorial Day should also be a time to acknowledge and think about the achievements of all the soldiers who saved the country during the Civil War. Sojourner Truth had been living in Michigan in Battle Creek for some years, and she helped raise men into the 102nd Regiment. She traveled the state, urged men to sign up, which is pretty notable. Only 2 African American women came out of slavery with any prominence. One was Harriet Tubman in Maryland, and the other was Sojourner Truth from the New York Hudson River Valley. Sojourner Truth never spoke with a Southern dialect. She spoke with a Dutch accent, because that was what she first learned. In Washtenaw County, during the Civil War, 25% of the white men served in the military. Guess what the figure was for African American men? Of military age, 25% of military-aged white men served in the military. 75% of black men of military age in the county served in the military. Whites, of course, could be in the military from the beginning of the war. African Americans only the last year, almost 2 years. It was a very bloody war. About 625,000 Americans died in the Civil War. 6% of northern white men aged 13 to 43 were killed in the war. 6%. In the South, 18% of white men in the same age group died in the war. I said killed. In most wars, people are not killed in combat. Most wartime deaths are due to disease. And of the 180,000 African American men who served in the US Navy or Army, about 20% were killed or died in the war. Approximately 10% of the 102nd USCT died during the war. Some of them died at the large Confederate prison camp in Andersonville, Georgia, which was not meant to kill everybody who was put there, but it had extraordinarily high casualty rates for a variety of reasons. Highland Cemetery has the graves of at least 105 men who served in the Civil War, nearly all of whom died after the war. There were some who died after they enlisted in the Army, and they died right here in Ypsilanti before their unit was deployed. They died because of infections, disease. Many of them died in what's now called the Thompson Building, which is about half a mile down River Street, recently renovated. You can rent or buy a really fancy, expensive apartment there now. I mean, I don't know if you can, but it's good for Ypsilanti that it's been renovated. It was built standing empty for 60 years. It was a barracks in its first couple of years. It wasn't built to be a barracks, but it became a barracks. Of the 105 or so Civil War veterans buried here in Highland, about 30 are African American men. Okay. What about that first Memorial Day I keep mentioning? To understand that, we need to go back to where the Civil War began, Charleston, South Carolina. That's where Fort Sumter was attacked by the Confederates in April 1861. And it's a major, beautiful city. By spring of 1865, 4 years later, Charleston had been under siege for a year, massive bombardments. Much of the city was in ruins. Warehouses, many, many warehouses filled with the valuable stuff of the slave economy, cotton bales, hundreds and thousands of cotton bales. They caught fire. There was a massive fire. Charleston was evacuated. Most of the white people left Charleston. After the long siege of Charleston, the U.S. Army landed troops in the harbor. They marched up Meeting Street, a very prominent street in Charleston. These troops included men not from the 103rd U.S. Colored Troops, but from the 21st U.S. Colored Troops. So black men and other U.S. soldiers marching into the conquered city of Charleston. And men of the 21st U.S. Colored Infantry were carrying their U.S. Army rifle, had a pin on their chest, or a button on their coats, U.S. And they were singing songs of liberation as they marched into the heart of where the Confederacy was, the Civil War started. And hundreds and thousands of black, newly emancipated slaves were watching. It was a sight to behold, no doubt. It was the kind of thing that the great scholar, activist W.E.B. Du Bois, in his great book, Black Reconstruction in America, referred to as the coming of the Lord. The Union Army brought freedom. And then the war ended. Lee surrendered in Virginia. President Lincoln was assassinated. A big festival took place the day Lincoln was killed, before he was killed, in Charleston. This major who had taken the American flag down at Fort Sumter rose the same flag back up the flagpole. And about 3,000 freed slaves were on Fort Sumter, a small, small island in the harbor, to celebrate that with him. But that same day, Lincoln was killed. So I'm skipping over a lot of details. David Blight describes this in some detail in his great book, Race and Reunion. One of the things that had happened as Charleston was under siege was the Confederates turned a racetrack, a fancy racetrack called the race course, the Washington race course in the city, into a prison. And at least 250 Union soldiers died there of disease or starvation. The prison was just in the open track in the center of the field. No latrines, no adequate sanitation. 250 men at least died and were buried in one big mass grave. And in the weeks between the end of the war and May 1st, hundreds of black workmen took it upon themselves to bury the United States dead with some dignity. So they reburied them. They built a big fence, high fence, around the racetrack. They whitewashed the fence. On the entrance, they put an archway above it. And it said, Martyrs of the Race Course. I keep saying racetrack, but the term that was used at the time was a race course. And then on May 1st, there was a notable, unprecedented dedication. It was called Decoration Day. There was a parade of at least 10,000 people around the race course. The New York Tribune correspondent reported on it. He wrote, "This was a procession of friends and mourners as South Carolina and the United States have never seen." The procession was led by 3,000 black school children. Black school children, they're not supposed to be taught. They're not supposed to have schools. But they did on the outer islands off South Carolina. And they had been brought to the city to celebrate or to commemorate. These children carried armloads of roses, and they were singing the Union Army's marching song, John Brown's Body. Several hundred black women followed, carrying baskets of flowers, wreaths, and crosses. And then came black men marching in cadence, followed by contingents of Union infantrymen. Within the cemetery enclosure, a black children's choir sang, "We'll rally around the flag, the Star-Spangled Banner, and spirituals." And then a series of black ministers read from the Bible, read from Scripture. We don't know what verses they read, but you can imagine. After the dedication of the cemetery, the crowd dispersed to the infield to do what many people still do on Memorial Day. Enjoy music, have a picnic, talk with your friends and loved ones. The war was over and Memorial Day had been invented by the former slaves. in a ritual of remembrance and consecration, they boldly announced what the war was all about. It was about their freedom and about saving the United States from the traitors who had tried to destroy it. Despite the size of this event and how the war had just been over for a few weeks, and it was covered in a number of newspapers, memory of the Charleston first Memorial Day, Decoration Day, was soon suppressed. By 1866, other cities claimed to have invented Memorial Day. Oh, we think we ought to honor those dead. And that was done in the South. Columbus, Georgia did it. And it spread to the North as well. One of the things notable about the holiday of Memorial Day is that it quickly became the first American holiday where people from a variety of ethnic groups, immigrant groups, could celebrate or commemorate, participate in, as equals. You're in a band that plays Irish music. You're in a band that plays Negro spirituals. You play first and then the other one will play. And bring a picnic. Everybody can participate, black and white as well, at least in the North. Down in the South, the black people weren't so welcomed. The Memorial Day holiday did spread across the country. In the white South, in the decades after the war, Memorial Day, Decoration Day became a way to mourn the defeat of the Confederacy without admitting why the Confederacy lost the war. Blaming it on just, oh, those Yankees, they cheated. They had too many men, too many guns. They outnumbered us. We were brave, they were cowards, but they overwhelmed us. Which was not really true. And the Confederacy avoided, the South, white South avoided confronting the fact that the war had started because of a fundamental strategic miscalculation. The entire South had a population of 9 million people. 4 million of those people were enslaved. And guess what? When almost half the people in your country want the enemy to win, the enemy has a big advantage. In addition to the ideological and moral reasons for the South to be outnumbered. Many people in the North, in that first generation or two after this war, refused to accept this idea that the war was all about bravery and valor. General Sherman, who was no anti-racist, but he was a very good soldier. He and Frederick Douglass were two very different people, different sets of ideas, who believed that the war had been between us, one side that was wrong, and that side lost, and the other side that had been right and that had won. And Douglass and General Sherman did not want to put them on the same level. Although eventually, that point of view died out. And by about 1915, the lost cause idea of the Civil War was dominant nationwide. And it was remained dominant throughout most of the next century. I had arguments as a kid with school teachers about the cause of the war. The Civil War was caused by slavery. No, it wasn't. Yes, it was. Come up here, Mr. Higbee. They didn't call me Mr. Higbee. Come up here, Mark. Put your hand out, and then whack with a ruler across the hand. And that just taught me that that guy was a mean bully. But it shut up my classmates. I wasn't whipped or physically hurt too often by my school teachers in Public School 70 in Indianapolis, but they were memorable occasions. And most of them had to do with defending white supremacy. I am almost done. I know I'm out of time. Slavery is the founding trauma of American history. We have not yet recovered from that trauma and the trauma of Jim Crow that followed it. If you believe in the Constitution of the United States, and I do, it's not perfect, but I believe in it, and if you believe that the Constitution should be taken literally, the 3 amendments passed in the first 5 years after the Civil War are notable and important. The 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. And each of these civil amendments end with a clause that says, and it varies a little bit from these 3 amendments to the other, but these amendments end with a clause that says, the Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. Well, Congress has the power to pass laws enforcing the 15th Amendment, which grants to the former slaves the right to vote. Until the US Supreme Court says it doesn't, as it did in 2013 in this decision out of Alabama called Shelby, in which 5 out of 9 justices said, no, that's not reasonable. That violates the Constitution. Even though Congress had passed that provision in the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and renewed it a number of times by overwhelming majorities. The first time it wasn't passed by an overwhelming majority, but later on it was. So Chief Justice John Roberts leads a white supremacist organization called the United States Supreme Court, which was called in the late 19th century the graveyard of liberty. And that is not a bad name for it, because the soldiers of the Civil War who were fighting to save the country and to create a new birth of liberty, a new birth of freedom, as Lincoln put it, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were enactments of that. The 14th Amendment says all people have equal protection of the law. All people, not just citizens, all people. Tell that to an immigrant child put in a cage by the United States government. All people have equal protection of the law. Memorial Day is a holiday to commemorate those who lost their lives during military service in the wars of the United States. Most of the war dead are buried near where they died in battle or at national cemeteries. This cemetery, Highland Cemetery, is not a national cemetery, but there are still memorials to individuals who lost their lives in the wars and individual graves whose families brought the bodies back here in mostly the 20th century, although there are a couple Civil War bodies who were brought back from the South. At the southern end of Highland Cemetery, there's a number of graves next to the Soldiers' Monument, and they're graves here, mostly of men who served in the US military during the Civil War. Many of them have inscriptions with their name, and a number of others just say, U.S. soldier, 27th Michigan Infantry. Those unnamed headstones are over the bodies of men who died in the U.S. Army, but here in Ypsilanti, in the barracks. So they're war dead, but they did not die in battle. And there's also a monument in general to the unknown war dead. I believe this was a post-World War II edition. But In most wars, nearly every war, there are more people killed from disease than killed from combat directly. Now, why does that happen? Well, it's a very simple principle. We need, as human beings, we need to keep our bodily waste separate from our drinking water. And that's complicated. Civilizations learned how to do that. But when you move large numbers of soldiers in a short period of time from one place to another, and they often put their latrine upstream from their drinking water, and it can produce terrible consequences. Most of the soldiers who died here in Ypsilanti died probably from chronic diarrhea or other severe diseases born from this kind of lack of sanitary conditions. But there are also graves here of other men who died after the war and were put here in this little section of the cemetery honoring soldiers of the Civil War. And significantly, both those who died here in Ypsilanti during the war and those soldiers who died and were buried here long after the war, some of them were white and some of them were African American. The radical Republican Congressman Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, one of Congress's greatest advocates for racial equality, he wanted to take all the land of the slave owners and give it to the former slaves. He never got that through Congress, but he did advance the cause of equality. And he died and was buried in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And he chose to be buried in the graveyard of an African American church in Lancaster, because that was the only place in Thaddeus Stevens' hometown where his burial could honor his belief in human equality. So I don't know much about the cemetery's nationwide practice, but in Lancaster, home of the great radical Republican congressman advocate of equality, they did not have the kind of racial integration side by side in the graves that Ypsilanti already had. There are a number of particular graves I want to talk about. Here's the grave of Dudley Fox. He was born in Kentucky as a slave around the year 1830. He died in 1906. He lived a life of 76 years. He enlisted in the U.S. Army as a private at age 33 in November 1863. In the first months that the U.S. Army was allowing black men to enlist in the war. He enlisted in the Army the same month that Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, in which Lincoln referred to how these men who had died at Gettysburg and elsewhere had helped the country reach a new birth of freedom. Mr. Dudley Fox was a member here in Ypsilanti of the AME Brown Chapel Church, and there is a window at that church built. The church was built after his death, but in his honor, a stained glass window. A few graves over is the grave of William Jones, Company D, the 102nd United States Colored Troops. I forgot to mention the regiment that Dudley Fox was in, Company F of the 2nd Michigan Cavalry. Mr. Jones was born 50 years before the Civil War began. He died in 1899. He was born in North Carolina as a slave. He ran away, somehow got to Indiana, and then to Canada, and then to Ypsilanti, and into the United States Army, where he fought to destroy the institution of slavery and to save the country, which was, of course, the uniting purpose for all the African American soldiers in the Civil War. And a couple further over is the grave of Lorenzo Thompson, who served in Company E of the 11th United States Colored Heavy Artillery Regiment of Rhode Island. He was born in Ohio in 1842, died in 1886. His regiment had a newspaper edited and produced by other black soldiers called the Black Warrior. His unit, his regiment, served mostly in the swamps of Louisiana and Texas, a lot of hard labor, not a lot of combat, but a lot of casualties due to disease. There's also here a grave for Percival Murphy in this middle row. And Private Murphy served in Company K of the 102nd United States Colored Troops, and he died in 1893. Before this monument was created, a couple years before, born in Ohio around 1825. So he, Percival Murphy, was a free person of color from the North who enlisted in the Army at an older age than most Civil War soldiers were. He lived in Ypsilanti at least by the year 1860, before the war started. So he joined up here in Ypsilanti. And the regiment was a Michigan-raised unit. And there are approximately 20 individual graves of men who served in that regiment here in the Highland Cemetery. And there are probably another dozen or so men who from that regiment in the cemetery, but their graves do not have markers. They might have started out with wooden crosses, but wooden crosses do not last. These are markers provided by the U.S. War Department, made, I believe, in Springfield, Massachusetts. And there's James H. Falls. His grave is also here. He served in an Ohio regiment of the U.S. Colored Troops, Company H, 27th U.S. Colored Volunteers. James Falls was wounded at the Siege of Petersburg in Virginia. He was at the Battle of the Crater, the Battle of Boydton Plank Road, and other Virginia and North Carolina battles. Here at the southern tip of the cemetery is what's called the Soldiers' Monument. It was unveiled on Memorial Day, 1895. And as it says at the top, as the years of the war, 1861 to 1865, and at the bottom it says, they died to make their country free. This unveiling of this monument in 1895 involved an audience of thousands of people from Ypsilanti, from the surrounding areas, and other places had come to see it. Now at the time, the trees over here, there's a hill right behind these trees that are behind the monument. And if the trees were not there, you could see most of the city of Ypsilanti. This is one of the highest points in the city. And the monument was selected at this spot so it overlooks the city. Now, since then, there's been industrial development at the bottom of the hill, 20th century development, various manufacturing and other things, and some trees have grown up on the hillside. So it's not as visible then. But when the monument was unveiled, it was a big event. The monument was paid for by Mrs. Starkweather, the same benefactor who paid for the chapel on this cemetery. The chapel was in honor of her late husband. This monument was in honor of the soldiers who died to make their country free. And that is an interpretation. It's a truthful, accurate interpretation of what the U.S. soldiers did, what they accomplished. They freed the country of slavery. They also saved the United States. There was, in the years of Reconstruction and the 20 years after it and ongoing, a battle over the meaning of the Civil War, an ideological battle. And the first, as I already explained, the origins of Memorial Day had one particular interpretation to honor the emancipation of the slaves, how the country had become a free country. Another contending interpretation, the Civil War was all about courage, about valor. These brave men, North and South, they were brave, and we celebrate them for that, without much talking about what the war was about. And Frederick Douglass and African Americans and most Northern veterans of the war thought the war was about two things: saving the country and freeing the slaves. And they were less invested in the idea of reconciling the country. Many people said the cause of the war was irrelevant. They didn't say that during the war, but in decades after they did. But this monument clearly sides with the emancipationist point of view. That doesn't mean that every person who attended the unveiling in 1895 agreed with that, but the monument has the truth. They died to make their country free. The monument was also erected by the Women's Relief Corps of Ypsilanti in the memory of the men in the War of the Great Rebellion fought to uphold their country's flag. The group, the Women's Relief Corps, was an organization common in the North in many communities of women who wished to commemorate the Civil War by erecting statues and monuments like this one. Although this is one of the best I've ever seen in terms of an enduring work of art. We're at the grave of James Pullen, who served in Company H of the 2nd Cavalry Volunteers. He died in December 1866, about a year and a half after the war ended, at age 42 and a half years old. So he was born in about 1824. As his monument says, he died for his country. And it's a pretty fancy headstone. No doubt his family or loved ones provided this. It was not provided by the War Department. He died for his country, and there's an image of 2 American flags crossed. So I believe that James Pullen was badly injured in the war. Where, I don't know. But he came home to Ypsilanti, and he spent the next year and a half recovering or not recovering from his war wounds, and then died. As it says on the headstone, he died for his country. His loved ones knew he died for his country. He may also have had what we now call post-traumatic shock, which was not, of course, recognized in the 19th century, but medical historians recognize the symptoms of it for countless Civil War veterans. In World War I, it was referred to as shell shock, but it was not even then with any kind of sophisticated analysis. I believe James Pullen was no doubt a white man, but he died for his country. He fought to save the country from the states that had committed treason, trying to destroy the country to uphold the principle that some people can own other people as property. And probably James Pullen was like many other white soldiers, and like President Lincoln. Their views on the issue of slavery and of human equality changed a great deal in the years from 1861, when the war began, and 1865, when the war ended. So it's this monument here, this obelisk. On this side is the Civil War veteran, John F. Miller, who was a sergeant in Company A of the 4th Michigan Cavalry. He died at Mitchellsville, Tennessee on December 6, 1862, aged 30 years and 9 months. Now, clearly in this case, Sergeant Miller had a family with some resources, as witnessed by the obelisk headstone, and that they retrieved his body from Tennessee long before it was normal or common for people to bring their dead loved ones home from far away. That didn't become American government practice on a large scale until the First World War, until after the First World War, actually. The dead from World War I, or what was then called the Great War, were brought home mostly to national cemeteries, which were created shortly after the Civil War at places like Arlington, Virginia. This is the grave of Stephen Rodman, Company C, 102nd United States Colored Troops. He was born in Knoxville, Tennessee. Around the year 1843, he was born a slave. He died in April 1909. The newspaper published an article on his death, and the headline was, "A well-known Ypsilanti man is dead." Stephen Rodman, first name is often given as Thomas Stephen Rodman, but on the headstone it's Stephen Rodman. Stephen Rodman lived on Harriet Street here in Ypsilanti, and he was, according to the newspaper article, noticeable for his military bearing. He carried himself upright. He ran a restaurant, apparently he owned the restaurant for years in Ypsilanti. He also did other labor, as most African Americans did, labor working in a store of the Rexford family, a well-known Ypsilanti merchant company. They have a big family plot here in the cemetery, fancy headstones. This, of course, is a headstone provided by the U.S. War Department. He also worked as a janitor for St. Luke's Episcopal Church. He left a widow, but no children. He was a member of the local African American groups, like the Colored Masons, the Odd Fellows, and he was a Republican Party activist in Ward 1 on the south side of Ypsilanti. He was also a fine musician. He traveled in a colored band performing with a circus. How long and for how often, I don't know. But one of the fellow musicians in this traveling circus band was Benjamin Harper, who was a fellow member of the 102nd U.S. Colored Troops. We'll see Benjamin Harper's grave in a little while. It has a modern Veterans Administration headstone to replace the older one that had fallen or broken or disappeared. This is one of the original from 1909. I do not know what instruments Corporal Benjamin Harper or Private Rodman played. I would like to know that. Private Rodman is one of the veterans buried here that somehow I feel closest to, even though he was buried 50 years before I was born. A versatile man who, after slavery, after he had helped destroy slavery, was able to create a fulfilling life. Here's another grave of a soldier from the 102nd U.S. Colored Troops. This is the grave of Jeremiah Snively, Company H. He was born in 1843 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He was the seventh of 9 children in his family. At least 4 brothers served in the American Civil War. Why? They probably didn't need to. All of them. There wasn't a draft that reached all black people. Black people weren't allowed to join the army until middle 1863. But men like Jeremiah Snively and his brothers joined, no doubt, because they believed in destroying slavery. Their family apparently had deep roots in Pennsylvania and had become free under the 1780 Revolutionary War Act of Emancipation. He moved from Lancaster, ended up in Canada for a while, and then moved with 2 brothers to Michigan and joined the USCT in 1863. Another brother joined a Pennsylvania regiment of the United States Colored Troops. He was 19 when he enlisted 1864. His oldest brother, Zachariah, stayed in Pennsylvania, and he served in the 3rd Pennsylvania Regiment of the USCT. He had a big funeral when he died in March 1897. He was a member of the Grand Army of the Republic, the largest fraternal organization in the North after the Civil War. Its individual chapters were not integrated by race, but there were many African American chapters as well as the white chapters. He was also a member of the Masons here in Ypsilanti, died in his late 50s. And on the other side of the maple tree here, a grave of another member of the United States Colored Troops. Both of these headstones are modern Veterans Administration replacement headstones installed about 20 years ago because the original headstones had fallen down and disappeared. My neighbor, John Delcamp, led the effort to get the VA to do that, and the VA did so. This headstone is a little bit misleading. It says David York, Private, Company B, 102nd USCT. And it has a date of death. April 18th, 1864. Well, this is probably actually the grave not of David York, but his younger brother, George, who died in Ypsilanti, age 15, I think. He was buried with a mislabeled grave, and then it's hard to get the government to correct a mistake. The Yorks were leading members of the Ypsilanti community. David York lived for years after the Civil War. He lived until January 1896. His daughter, Lucy, married another Civil War veteran, John Anderson. David York, the older brother who's not buried here, is probably buried at another spot here in this cemetery. They were members of the Grand Army of the Republic, the Masons. His son, Walter, was a barber, also a leading member of the Ypsilanti black community. And he helped build the AME church building on South Adams, which is still there. It's no longer the AME church, which has a fancier modern building off Michigan Avenue, but the original building is still a church, an active church building. This is the grave of Washington Hawkins and his wife. Washington Hawkins was born in about 1835 in Maysville, Kentucky. He died in 1916 here in Ypsilanti. He ran away at age 19 and made a full life. He enlisted in Company C of the 102nd U.S. Colored Troops. Next to his, he has two headstones. One is halfway sunken into the ground. That's a War Department provided headstone. And actually has three, because then in front of these, there's one for his wife and with her dates, 1845 to 1918. And for his headstone father, 1836 to 1915. There's always often a little ambiguity in the dates of enslaved people's lives, especially their birth dates. He enlisted in February of 1865, just the last 6 months of the war. And he was mustered out of the U.S. Army in Charleston, South Carolina, at the end of September 1865. Keep that in mind. Mustered out at the end of September 1865 in Charleston, South Carolina. He was widowed and then remarried. He remarried a woman named Boyles, became a stepfather to her children, and one of his stepsons, Lewis Boyles, became the president of McKinley Institute in Kentucky, an institute dedicated to training black school teachers. So when he died in 1915 or 1916, depending on which source we use, he was said to be the oldest colored resident in Ypsilanti. And he was an important man in the Ypsilanti community. Just a little bit north of the grave of Washington Hawkins is the grave of William Ambrose, another veteran of the U.S. Colored Troop Regiment 102, Company D. William Ambrose was born in the 1820s, some date, unsure exactly when, and he died on April 28, 1896. So he was an older man to enlist in the war, and he died at roughly age 75 or so. He was in the same regiment as Washington Hawkins, the same company, He mustered out, left the Army on the same day, September 30th, 1865, in Charleston, South Carolina, as Washington Hawkins, and as many men of the 102nd. A newspaper article about his death said that Mr. Ambrose, colored, age 72, died at his home on Monday. Was an old soldier and a member of the Grand Army of the Republic. This is the grave of Edward Wilson, Company H, 102nd U.S. Colored Troops. He was born around 1830 in Kentucky. He died in 1884 here in Ypsilanti on the 7th of July, 1884. He enlisted in the Army in February 1865 and was mustered out on that same day as many of his compatriots, September 30th, 1865, in Charleston, South Carolina. His wife's grave is next to him, and she has her own separate headstone. It's broken and sunken in the ground somewhat. A newspaper article published on the occasion of his death said that Mr. Wilson has been a valued member of the AME Church for over 20 years, and his loss is felt to be a severe one. Born a slave, made a life as a free man here in Ypsilanti. Here at the northeast corner of the Highland Cemetery, there are a few graves, including several that we'll discuss. But beyond these marked graves, there's what looks like a field. This field includes graves of two types. There are graves here that were moved to the cemetery from other Ypsilanti cemeteries. And there are headstones from those graves, many of them. They're lying flat on the ground. And beyond that, there is a large potter's field. That's the term in the English-speaking world for a graveyard for people who died in poverty, could not pay for their own burial, could not pay for a marker. Estimates vary over how many people are buried here in Potter's Field. I've heard maybe 100, and other estimates of maybe 600, maybe 2,000. No doubt many of them were marked with wooden crosses, but wood does not last. And I don't know when this Potter's Field was last actively used. And right here is the grave of Thomas J. Davis, Company B, 102nd U.S. Colored Troops. He was born in Virginia around the year 1830. He died in April 1895. So he died just before the Soldiers' Monument was unveiled at the southern end of the cemetery, a few hundred yards from here. He came to Ypsilanti sometime before 1861, before the Civil War broke out. He and his brother worked as laborers on farms in the surrounding area, and then Mr. Davis worked as a peddler. He lived near the intersection of Emmerich and Towner Streets on Ypsilanti's southeast side in what was then a largely German immigrant, German language speaking neighborhood. Another man who was born as a slave and helped destroy slavery and made a life as a free man in the United States. And a short distance from his grave is another modern VA provided headstone for Benjamin Harper, who was enlisted in the 102nd Regiment, Company F, as a corporal. He was born in Indiana. He enlisted in November 1863, worked as a laborer in Ypsilanti for years, worked as a waiter, and like his fellow soldier from the 102nd Regiment, he was a professional musician. Like Mr. Rodman, he traveled with the circus. Benjamin Harper lived at 406 South Adams Street and also at another time near the intersection of First Street and Monroe here in Ypsilanti. He was wounded at the Battle of Bradford Springs in April 1865, near the very end of the war. Wounded, but survived. Here are two stones in honor of the grave sites of two black men who served in the U.S. Colored Troops. The one lower down on the hillside is hard to read because it's sunken and sloping, but it is for, I believe, for John Holden, who served in Company C of the 6th Regiment of the USCT. He was born in 1845. He died in April 1900. All that is visible on the stone, if you get down on your knees and read it, is Jonathan, or J.N.D. Holden, Company D. No doubt there may be other script visible that has sunken into the ground. 10 feet to the west is the grave of John Anderson, and John Anderson served in Company D of the United States Colored Troops. The headstone says 103rd USCT, but I believe that is an error of when they made the headstone. I believe he did serve in the 102nd Regiment. He enlisted in February 1865, served till September 1865, when he was mustered out in Charleston, South Carolina. John Anderson told the story that he could not say when he was born because he was born back in slavery. He could not name who his parents were because he was born in slavery. And apparently he was quite a raconteur, quite a storyteller. And he also told about how he escaped from slavery and how he was being shot at while he was running from the slave owners and trying to calculate whether they would shoot him and risk destroying a valuable piece of property, which he estimated to be worth $1,100, or if they would just try to shoot and scare him to stop running. But he kept running, and he got, I believe, all the way from Missouri to Michigan. Another grave is of a man named Charles Anderson. I don't know where his grave is here in the cemetery. Charles Anderson was born in 1845, died in 1918. He enlisted at age 18 in Zanesville, Ohio, in Company E of the 5th Regiment of the United States Colored Troops. He worked as a janitor for 26 years at the Ypsilanti Savings Bank. He lived in Ypsilanti for 46 years. His son Fred was a professional musician, good enough to play in London, England. In the regiment's enrollment book, he is described as a mulatto, meaning one parent was a white person and the other parent was a black person. At the time, mulatto was just a descriptive term. This is the grave of Elias Rouse, Company N of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. He was wounded in July 1863 at the Battle of Fort Wagner outside of Charleston, South Carolina. Fort Wagner is one of the pivotal battles of the war symbolically. It was not of great military consequence. Some military historians say that it had no military significance. But it proved something that many white Americans had doubt of. Black men could be good soldiers. And the regiment was commanded by Robert Gould Shaw, a young man of an abolitionist family in Massachusetts. But all the men in the regiment were black men. The Massachusetts Regiment was the first regiment open to black volunteers. And black men from around the country flocked to Massachusetts to get in the regiment because they wanted to get in the war to destroy slavery. Elias Rouse was born around 1833, 1837 in Kentucky. He died in 1899 here in Ypsilanti. He married the widow of a fellow black soldier, John Gay, who was in the 103rd U.S. Colored Troops, and John Gay was killed at Beaufort, South Carolina. When Elias Rouse got back to Ypsilanti, he married the widow. Family census from the 1890 soldiers census in Ypsilanti listed 10 household members for the year 1890. There are 10 members in the household, his wife, children, and stepchildren. Young children with the name Rouse, older children with the last name Gay, after their slain father. Mary Rouse owned their home, 420 Emmett Street, just a little bit south of what's now the EMU campus. And Elias Rouse, no doubt, was proud to have served his country and served his people. In the Battle of Fort Wagner, it's commemorated in the Hollywood film starring Denzel Washington from about 30 years ago. And that's a pretty good film in terms of historical accuracy. But also, the regiment, the battle at Fort Wagner, was noted at the time in newspaper columns, newspaper coverage all across the country as demonstrating that black men could be great soldiers, just like any other group of men. A tremendous number of the men in the 54th Regiment died on the assault on Fort Wagner, including Captain Shaw and many others. When Abraham Lincoln first met Frederick Douglass in the next month, in August 1863, President Lincoln mentioned what Fort Wagner had done for convincing white people to recognize the potential of black people in America.